The previous video in this series, part 11, ended with our ancestors in the 5th Kentucky Infantry marching this way and that as generals tried to anticipate the movements of the massive Union Army under General Buell, as it was no doubt planning to leave Louisville to meet the Confederates occupying the entire interior of the state. The 5th had passed through West Liberty and Owingsville to an enthusiastic homecoming, then through Mount Sterling and Lexington before camping near Harrodsburg. General Buell's Union Army at Louisville was so big that he had no qualms about splitting it into three prongs, one headed toward the capital of Frankfort, one toward Bardstown, and still another toward Perryville. In response, General Bragg, who had moved his army from Munfordville to Frankfort, withdrew his Army of Mississippi with 16,800 men from the capital to Harrodsburg and set up his headquarters before sending the main force of his army on to Perryville, deciding he would make his stand there and wait for Buell, Perryville being a strategically important transportation hub and with a good water supply. While camping near Harrodsburg, Edward Garrett wrote, quote, "I went ahead with General to Harrodsburg over as hot and dusty and weary a road as I ever traveled. Crowded with tired soldiers of armies gone before. Got dinner at General Bragg's headquarters. Saw Bragg, Smith, Polk, Claiborne, Taylor, and other generals, and thousands of troops from every southern state. Great day of revelation," unquote. The next day, October 6, our ancestors in Marshall's army, within a day's march of Perryville, were ordered back to Lexington to defend it in case Buell focused his attention there. Marshall's forces had been combined with Kirby Smith's army out of Knoxville, and Smith was put in overall command. But Smith had chosen to keep his 21,000-man army autonomous from Buell, which would turn out to be a tactical blunder. On the 7th, it became clear that Buell was not going to attack Lexington and had veered south toward Perryville, as it was a feint to split the Confederates. Smith's army with the 5th Kentucky Infantry was ordered back toward Perryville once again in double quick time in the searing heat. By then, Buell's three columns were converging on Perryville, and when they met Confederate cavalry a mile north of town, skirmishing began. The fight spread when two regiments of Confederate infantry arrived, with both sides desperate to control the water supply. The next morning, driven by thirst, portions of the Union Army under Philip Sheridan rushed for Doctor's Creek, actually shown here near the scene of the battle, only to find brackish, algae-covered isolated pools in the nearly dry creek bed. It was shelled by Confederate artillery and the battle began in earnest. Bragg's 16,500 Confederates were outnumbered more than 3-1, and Smith had not yet arrived with our ancestors, but managed to hold on until Buell's reinforcements joined the fray and were forced to retreat to Perryville proper, where fighting continued in the streets that evening. Low on ammunition, Bragg retreated during the night to Harrodsburg. The 5th Kentucky Infantry with the Barkers and Gevedons only got within earshot of the artillery duel before the battle was over. Whether they were disappointed in missing out on the battle or relieved they had avoided a 20% chance of dying or being wounded less than 2 weeks before the end of their voluntary enlistment, we don't know. George Noble made no entry regarding their mood. When it was over, 7,607 men lay dead or wounded on the battlefield, 4,211 Union and 3,396 Confederate. While the rebels won a tactical victory considering the odds against them, they were forced to retreat. Historians lay part of the blame for the outcome at Perryville directly on Kirby Smith, whose desire for autonomy kept him from arriving on time. Edward Garrett provided other possible reasons in his bitter, despondent entry. Quote, "Long remembered day, day of blasted hope and ruined fortunes, day of evil, dark day. Our army, unaided and unassisted by the people of the state they came to deliver, weakened by weary marches, sickness, and battle, to 33,000 stand now like a lion at bay, surrounded by 100,000 hungry minions of a ruthless despot. The conflict is unequal, the victory unworthy of the sacrifice of battle. We came into the state to meet and deliver friends. We met rather the scowl of enemies. We came to meet Kentuckians with arms and doors open and welcome. We met clenched teeth and closed doors," unquote. After the battle, Marshall separated his army from Kirby Smith's and retreated through Richmond east to Clay City, where he rested his men for a week, and then moved them to Jeffersonville, and the 5th Kentucky Infantry got ever closer to where they began their 1 year of voluntary service. While at Jeffersonville, the men of the 5th, and our ancestors in particular, learned that their original commander and the one who had recruited most of them to join the cause, Andrew Jackson May, had submitted a letter of resignation to Marshall 2 weeks earlier. Marshall's endorsement on the back of May's letter read, quote, "The health of Colonel May forbids his performance of active field duty at present," unquote. No specific illness was mentioned by May or Marshall. The news simply added to the low morale in the ranks after the retreat from Perryville. It was compounded by news that the Confederate legislature in Richmond, Virginia, had passed a new law exempting anyone with 20 or more slaves from military service, confirming the belief that they were in, quote, "a rich man's war and a poor man's fight," unquote. Finally, Marshall had rejected the vote by the men of the 5th Kentucky Regiment that they would re-enlist for the duration of the war if they were allowed to furnish their own horses and serve as the actual mounted unit indicated at the top of their muster cards. On October 20th, 1 year to the day after the formation of the 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiment, it camped in a field 2 miles south of Hazel Green with the intent to veer southeast towards Virginia. The men were in no mood to leave Kentucky and their families behind again, especially on foot. George Noble, who had joined the 5th at the end of 1861 and not part of the original recruiting class, recounted, quote, "When they were ordered into a line, they refused to obey, saying they were going home. The sergeant major reported to the colonel and he to General Marshall. The general ordered them to fall into line and stack their arms, and they were discharged," unquote. He had discharged the entire unit, no matter their joining date. In a letter of explanation for the discharge of an entire regiment written by Marshall to the Secretary of War, he said, quote, "The 5th Kentucky Regiment of Infantry was mustered for 12 months from about the 21st of October, 1861, and was composed almost entirely of men from the mountain counties of Kentucky. When the act requiring the 12 months men to reorganize was passed, these men were told by Brigadier General John S. Williams that they were under a contract for 12 months only, and, as the Conscript Act had no force in Kentucky, they would be entitled to discharge at the end of their special enlistment. This was also taught to them by Colonel A.J. May, then in command of the regiment, and under these teachings they refused to reorganize themselves, saying they would not subject themselves as conscripts for the remaining 2 years," unquote. Marshall had allowed the men 3 choices. After a year of hard and bitter marching and fighting, they could be honorably discharged. They could remain with a newly reorganized or consolidated 5th Infantry with the promise of more adventures outside the state, or they could continue the fight by joining one of several new cavalry regiments being formed in eastern Kentucky. Noble said, quote, "Over half the regiment quit, but enough held together to recruit up a new regiment. The old soldiers departed every way," unquote. Muster cards show that at least 3 of the 4 Morgan County Barker brothers were present at muster out: Henry M., John C., and George W. There is no card for the youngest Barker brother, William Likens. Both surviving Gevedon brothers, William Leach and Willis Green, were present as well. And with that, as Garrett's short entry reads, quote, "The 5th Kentucky was disbanded this morning. 12 months' service expired. A magnificent regiment vanished," unquote. To learn what happened to many of the people featured in this video series in the days, months, and years that followed, look for Part 13, the epilogue to this series on the Barkers and Gevedons in the Civil War.